Please welcome the world's loveliest polymath, Kevin Jackson.
Hello, Cleveland. Sorry, I'm Kevin, but people call me Moose. And for many years I was working on this book, which was rescued by the delightful and unbelievably chic Jocasta. Thank you. When I went to social gatherings, people said, what are you working on, if they were nice? And I said, I'm working on a book about the year 1922, which prompted the obvious question, why don't you have a life? Or the related question, have you ever considered therapy? But the actual answer, I suppose, to why 1922 goes back a very long way to when I was a tiny. And I had a summer job working at the National Westminster Bank in Threadneedle Street in the city. And I was dimly aware that T.S. Eliot had worked as a bank clerk when he was writing The Wasteland. And I was very interested in The Wasteland at that age because I was a nerd. And then I read, that same summer I read Ulysses, and I realised that they were both written in 1922, and I thought, stack me vitals, that's a coincidence. Or was it? So, cut to 150 years later, I wrote a book which sort of slightly explains why it isn't entirely a coincidence, and which also tries to recreate in a very sort of fragmentary and far-reaching way what the whole world was like in 1922, which includes, by the way, my colleague over here, the Great Migration, characters that include members of the Harlem Renaissance, and of course the great Louis Armstrong, who made his own migration from New Orleans to Chicago, and therefore began jazz as we know it today. Anyway, so the African-American contribution is duly noted and duly respected. Anyway, I'm going to read you very kindly, Jocasta suggested it's like a dinner party, so I'm going to read you, I hope not too long a passage about an actual dinner party, which is one of the most amazing dinner parties of the century, certainly of that year, where both Stravinsky, Diaghilev, Proust and Joyce were all guests, so it didn't go quite as well as it might have thought. So this is the 18th of May 1922. This was the night of the legendary modernist supper party at the Majestic Hotel in Paris. Diaghilev acted as master of ceremonies, but the hosts were Proust's friends Violet and Sidney Schiff. About 40 guests were invited, including, as Virginia's brother-in-law, the Art Critic Cry Bell reported, the four living men Sidney Schiff most admired: Picasso, Stravinsky, Joyce and Proust. Most were formally dressed, though Picasso wore a Catalan fajita wound around his head. Sorry. The company finally sat down to supper after midnight. Joyce blundered into the gathering at about the time coffee was being served. He was shabbily dressed and seemed bewildered, and it was widely and correctly assumed more than a little the worse for drink. According to Bell, he seemed far from well. Certainly he was in no mood for supper, but a chair was set for him on our host's right, and there he remained speechless, with his head in his hands and a glass of champagne in front of him. Joyce seldom needed an excuse to punish the white wine, but on this occasion it seems that he had been embarrassed by not owning proper evening dress and had been in serious need of some Dutch courage. The next latecomer was a very different character. I continue to quote Bell. At 2:30 in the morning, up popped Proust, white gloves and all, for all the world as if he'd just seen a light in a friend's window and had just come up on the chance of finding him awake. Physically, he did not please me, being altogether too sleek and dank and plastered. His eyes were glorious, however. Joyce recalled that Proust entered still wearing his fur coat and looking, quote, like the hero of the sorrows of Satan. Proust was given a place between Mr. Schiff and Stravinsky. The conversation did not go well. In the course of trying to pay the composer an elaborate compliment, Proust made the mistake of enthusing about Beethoven. His enthusiasm was sincere and founded on a genuine knowledge of Beethoven, especially the later works, but Stravinsky, well aware that Beethoven was very much the name to drop in fashionable Paris, was annoyed and replied grumpily. Proust, doubtless, monsieur, you admire Beethoven. I detest Beethoven. But chez Maître, surely those late sonatas and quartets, worse than all the others. And Sermet, the conductor, had to interrupt this awkward exchange to prevent it from escalating into a full-blown row. At about this point, Joyce began to snore, and so helped Bell to leave a sticky situation. The lady seated next to him hinted that she would like to be escorted home, and Bell was happy to oblige. Once he had left, however, Joyce ceased to snore and began talking to Proust. What exactly passed between them is uncertain, as different witnesses give different accounts. Most of them seem to agree, however, that this meeting between the two greatest novelists of the century was almost hilariously dull and pointless. In one version, Proust, do you like truffles? Joyce, yes, I do. In another, Proust, I have never read your works, Monsieur Joyce. Joyce, I've never read your works, Mr. Proust. In another, Joyce's own version, according to Frank Budgeon, Mr. Joyce, you know the Princess? No, monsieur. But you know the Comtesse? No, monsieur. Then you know Madame? No, monsieur. And so the versions multiply. According to one heard by William Carlos Williams, the two great men finally managed to hit it off rather well by talking about the one thing they certainly had in common, their poor health. Joyce griped about his eyes and his headaches, Proust about his dreadful stomach aches. They parted on cordial terms.